بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ونبينا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Inshallah, today we'll be starting with the chapter Babu Ma Ja'a Fi Sifati Sayfi Rasulillahi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the chapter in which the description of the sword of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam will be discussed. Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah has compiled this chapter with 4 narrations. It's a very brief chapter, and the following chapters are also in regards to the different attire, the different items that are worn when a person attends a battlefield. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's helmet, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam armor, and certain things would be discussed in the upcoming chapters as well. But before we can begin in discussing these chapters, I want to briefly touch a topic which is making a lot of space in the Muslim minds of today. And that is the methodology that was used in the spread of Islam in itself. Many times there's a misconception about how did Islam just spread like wildfire within the first century after the birth of Islam. After Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam migrated to Madinatul Munawwara, which was about 13 years after receiving prophethood, and after that, in the initial days, certain battles were fought defensively, and around when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered Makkatul Mukarramah, or when he attempted to enter Makkatul Mukarramah at the time of Sulh Hudaybiyah, there weren't that many Sahaba. But in Hajjatul Wada, which was only 3 years later, the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in multiplied in numbers to almost 124,000. From a very few in number to 124,000 within few years. And not only that, after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in the time of Abu Bakr radiyallahu anh's khilafah was mainly just to re-establish the khilafah and make sure that they're over the death of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Umar radiyallahu anh dispatched armies throughout the Arab Peninsula and even broader, just to make sure the message of Islam is spread. So many times there is a misconception about how did Islam spread in a very brief time to so many different lands, to the extent that lands which were thousands and thousands away from Madinatul Munawwara, they were accepting Islam. So there's a misconception that Islam was being forced upon the people. And I want to clarify this, because if in podiums, in venues like such as this, if we don't discuss this, then it would always remain in the hearts as an objection, and it always requires a clarification. So this is the reason why I wanted to just clarify certain facts in history of Islam. First and foremost, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, La ikraha fid din, that there is no compulsion in religion. That if a person wants to become Muslim, he will only become Muslim at will. And if a person chooses not to become a Muslim, there is no compulsion on that individual. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, in the last few years of his life, we discussed this in the past as well, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wrote letters to different leaders of different countries at that time. One was Kisra, which was the Persian Empire. There was the Roman Empire. Different emperors that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wrote a letter to, inviting them to Islam. And if we were to ponder over the subject of this letter, even though Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wrote one of the most brief letters in history, that a person could write, that he wrote very few sentences, but in each of these letters, if you were to examine the wording, in each letter, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that if you do not, as directly addressing the emperor himself, if you do not accept the message of Islam, the burden of all your people would also be upon you. And if you were to look at the letter that was written to Kisra, the Persian emperor, it says that Ismul Majus, that all the different worshippers that used to worship fire, that used to belong in Persia at that time, the burden of all those individuals not accepting Islam would also be upon you. And if you look at the letter that was written to the Roman emperor, it says Ismul Irsiyin, all those people who are under you, who fall under your rulership, if you do not accept the message of Islam, they will not accept it, and that burden will also come onto you. Similarly, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wrote the letter to Najashi, because they were mainly Christians at that time, the Ethiopian emperor, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used the word Ismun Nasara, that if you do not accept this message, all the Christians that reside under your rulership, the burden of all those individuals not accepting Islam would also come upon you. The reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mainly mentioned this, inviting all these leaders, is because there was some form of dictatorship of these rulers over their people. To the extent that we even find that the leaders themselves were so afraid to be overthrown that sometimes they themselves did not accept Islam for that exact fact. So even it comes in a riwayah in Sahih al-Bukhari that once when the letter was received by one of the kings, I'm forgetting the name, when he decided to accept Islam, he told the people around him that I accept the faith and I suggest you do the same. And immediately the people who were around him, they started rushing to the gates. And the wording that is used is very similar to a wild herd of sheep that would just run from if they would be frightened over something. Similarly, these individuals started running towards the gates as soon as the word Islam was mentioned. And then this ruler, he immediately retracted his statement by saying that no, I was just testing you how strong you are in your own faith. And he retracted his statement and he did not accept Islam. Similarly, we went over a narration in the time of Najashi when he accepted Islam. The people were almost close to overthrowing him, to the extent that he had to go and address the people, and the people understood and they accepted him as a Muslim, and it was okay. So the reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam felt the need to address all these people is because the dictatorship would prevent the people who are under their rulership to accept Islam. Alhamdulillah, living in the West, we have to truly appreciate the fact that we do have a lot of freedoms. And, one of the privileges of living in the Western world is the liberty and justice for all. And this is the reason why we're able to express our faith and believe in the religion that we want without having any restrictions. But a lot of these places, even though if you look at Arabia itself, which we will call Saudi Arabia as of now, it was always a tribal way of governorship. And even then, we know the types of trouble that the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in went through. So imagine if it was a dictatorship, that one person had the rulership over all the people. So similarly, it would become a reason for them to be hesitant in accepting Islam, because they would fear oppression. And this is the reason why Umar radiallahu an and the Khulafa after him, they made an attempt to spread the word of Islam into these emperors and to break down these empires, just so that if a person would practice the deen, would want to accept the message of Islam and to practice the deen, he would be able to do so, and not fearing what is to come from their dictator. Whenever Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would dispatch an army, or he would send anybody out to invite people of any land, the first thing that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would say, دَعُوهُمْ إِلَى الْإِسْلَامِ, that call them towards Islam. The first instruction is to talk to them, to see if there's any objection, to see if there's any clarification that is needed, see if they have any questions in their mind that need to be answered. These were the first instructions. And after, if they reject the message of Islam, you would tax them. And if they accept the tax, then immediately you're not to lift your sword. And then after that, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that this narration itself is in Sahih al-Bukhari also, that once Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anh, the sword of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was known as Saifullah. Once he attacked a group of people, and that group, when they were being attacked, they started uttering the kalima. But because of their accent, Khalid bin Walid radiallahu anh did not understand what they were saying. So basically the attack continued. When this news came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in describe the facial expression of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that his face changed color. And he was very, very upset. And he made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ya Allah, I am free from what Khalid has done. And this is in Sahih al-Bukhari, that I'm free, I declare myself completely free from what Khalid radiallahu anhu has been done. That if they were truly Muslims, I don't want to have the blame that a Muslim leader of an army ever went and slaughtered another, or killed or attacked any other Muslim. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly mentions that if a person kills another believer, فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمُ خَالِدًا فِيهَا, that he would be in eternal hellfire. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment, because Muslims can never be attacked by another Muslim. But what the key to remember here is that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is assigning an invisible shield to every non-believer. That all you have to say is La ilaha illallah. There's so many munafiq that were in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who used to join the congregation of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who used to attend the gatherings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They used to socialize with the Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. But their iman never entered their heart. So similarly, when these attacks were ever taking place, if it was forcefully to attack, to accept the kalima, it's very easy that a person could just recite La ilaha illallah, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is giving every person an invisible shield. That if you recite La ilaha illallah, whether you recite it from the heart or not, to the extent that once a sahabi came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said that once I attacked an individual and he was reciting the kalima. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said it was haram for you to strike him because he had recited the kalima. So when the sahabi, he said he was only doing it to save his life. The wording that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam answered with was, "Halla shaqaqta qalbu?" That did you rip out his heart to see whether he was reciting it from his heart or not? Because you are only liable to see what he is uttering. If it's just plainly from his mouth, then it is just from just orally, and that would suffice for him to save his life. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has assigned a shield to every non-believer, that if at that time truly the sword was being used to spread Islam, then it was very easy that a person could just try La ilaha illallah and he will never ever be questioned again. But this was never the way that Islam has been spread. Even if you look at statistics today, there are over 30 million Christians in the Middle East. 30 million. Out of those, almost 14 million are Coptic Christian Arabs. They are residing in Arabia as of today. And their generations and their lineage goes back to the time of Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, and in those times. So if truly Islam was being spread by compulsion, then obviously these wouldn't exist. And similarly, if you look at Muslims in India, Muslims ruled India for almost 1,000 years. Almost 1,000 years. Yet, if you look at India today, almost 80% of India is non-Muslim. Almost 80% of India is non-Muslims. If you were to look at Malaysia and Indonesia, that the two biggest countries of the Muslim population, to the extent that if you look at Indonesia, there are over 200 million Muslims there. Never ever was an army dispatched to these countries. They never even came close by these countries. But truly it was the ethics and the akhlaq and the characteristics of different tradesmen who visited Indonesia and Malaysia, and looking at their akhlaq and their ethics, people started accepting Islam, and now there are over 200 million Muslims in Indonesia. So if you were to ponder over these statistics, sword was never lifted outside of the Arab Peninsula. This is a fact. If somebody claims that it was raised outside of the Arab Peninsula, he is slandering every historian that existed. Because in reality, that never happened. So, even in Arabia, it was done with a purpose, and that is to make sure that everyone has the freedom to choose. And that is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam wanted to send these letters. Even in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was prohibited from entering Makkah al-Mukarramah, when he wanted to do the first Umrah, which was known as Umratul Qada, which he performed the year after, at that time, there was a treaty signed, about which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. So Umar radiallahu anhu, we know he was very hot-blooded. Now, when Umar radiallahu anhu is going back to Madinatul Munawwara, this narration comes down to Rasulullah. These verses were narrated to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam by Jibreel alayhi salam. Then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam recites these verses, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. So now, Umar radiallahu anhu, he gets even more emotional. That first, never ever in history that a person was stopped from entering Makkah al-Mukarramah to perform the pilgrimage. The first time in history we were stopped to go into Makkah. So that itself was already disturbing Umar radiallahu anhu. And then, now on the journey back to Madinatul Munawwara, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling this peace treaty Fathan Mubina, that we have declared an open victory. So he approaches Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam that, what is this Fathan Mubina? That what victory? We were there, we were stopped, and we are going back like cowards, and we did not fight, we did not even demand to enter, and we accepted every term that the kuffar have proposed, and yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is calling Fathun Mubina. What is this reason? And truly, it wasn't something that was to be answered at that moment, but rather in the upcoming months. Now, this sanction that was there on top of all the people, that they could not visit Madinatul Munawwara. They could not see Muslims for who they really are. They were always afraid for themselves. Now, this peace treaty got everybody to truly examine what Muslims were about. Truly examine the true belief of a Muslim. What are the true ethics of a believer? What are the different beliefs that a Muslim lives by? And this is the reason why clans after clans after clans started entering Madinatul Munawwara to see the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, to mention their objections to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, to get their questions answered. And this is what Allah Subhanahu Wa Ta'ala is mentioning, Fatham Mubina. Because this is the very same reason that when they were attempting to enter Makkah al-Munawwara, there were a few thousand. But 3 years later, when Hajjatul Wada took place, that is the time when they multiplied up to 124,000. And this was the exact reason that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam just wanted to put Islam in a place where it's visible to everyone, where the nur of Islam can be sighted by every believer without having any obstacles in his way. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls this treaty Fatham Mubina. And this is the true message of Islam, that a person just opens the book to see what truly Islam is, and immediately his heart just melts. Umar radiallahu anh, what sword was on Umar radiallahu anh? Rather, he was the sword that was sent out to wipe out Islam. But when he read Taha, ma anzalna alayka al-Qur'an litashqa. After a few pages, his heart just melted. He was sobbing. He was crying with tears only because the true message of Islam had entered the heart. And this is exactly the true methodology that is to be adopted in performing da'wah. We can't preach the religion. We have to live the religion. When we live the religion, then that is the greatest form of da'wah. Actions speak louder than words. Many times we want to go and take additional courses and we want to be very social to make sure that we are spreading the da'wah. But in reality, if we're not living the da'wah, we're not going to be able to have the effect that the other person has. That a person, actions, truly, if a person will have a book, it's written very beautifully. You can read it, and many times it might bring tears to your tears to your eyes. But in reality, if we're not living that lifestyle, then it is completely it's a hypocritic life of hypocrisy that we're living. So this is the reason why we have to live the religion rather than just briefly preaching the religion. So this is the true methodology that is to be adopted in spreading the true word of Islam. Inshallah, we'll continue on with the narrations, and we will discuss the narrations as they come. وبالإسناد المتصل منا عن الإمام الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى قال حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا وهب بن جرير قال حدثنا أبي عن قتادة عن أنس رضي الله عنه قال كانت قبيعة سيف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من فضة. The first narration is by Anas radiallahu an, in which he mentions that the handle of the sword of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was made of silver. The second narration is very similar. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن بشار قال حدثنا معاذ بن هشام قال حدثني أبي عن قتادة عن سعيد بن أبي الحسن قال كانت قبيعة سيف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من فضة. The second one is by Sa'ad ibn Abi al-Hasan al-Basri radiyallahu anh. He narrates that the handle of the sword of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam was made of silver. Due to the quality of silver, as we know that even nowadays, many times the true metal of gold and silver is used in a lot of electronics and a lot of different items because of its durability, because of its strength. The swords of those times, the handles of those were also made with silver, just so that it doesn't rust or it doesn't stain, and also because it's very, very durable. And that is the reason why many of those swords were made in silver. And the fuqaha ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in have allowed that silver can be used in arms, in different weapons, because there is a need for them. One thing that comes to mind, that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he was leaving for the battle of Badr, he knew that the odds were not in his favor at all. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, when he looked at the resources, they were very minimal. But the key thing to remember between Islam and other ways, many times we look at the resources rather than looking at the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam never ever concentrated on the resources, but rather he always concentrated on the living souls. So when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam counted the army, he did not look at how many swords or how many horses or what he had as far as resources are concerned, but rather he looked at how strong were the believers. He looked at how many believers he had that were carrying the heart that used to beat Allah, Allah. And he wanted to see how strong their faith is. And this is what he fought every battle through. That how strong are the people. Immediately, if you were to look at any institute or any other methodology, if they're exhausting their resources on materials, immediately is going to just materialize based on those resources, and the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not be there. If you look at nowadays, we talked about in our previous sessions about how bad of an issue we have about DWI, driving while intoxicated, or DUI, driving under the influence. But in reality, if you look at the commentaries that are given before every holiday, it's about now we have increased our police force and we have this many new ways we can track down driving while being intoxicated, so on and so forth. We have such radar detectors that we can immediately look at the behavior of a driver and know that this person is driving under the influence, so on and so forth. But in reality, how much effort is being exhausted in making sure that there is no drinking taking place? Absolutely zero. The sales of alcohol almost triple in the last few months of the year, from Thanksgiving to Christmas. Almost triple, and sometimes even more than that. The reason is because those are holiday season and a person is continuously drinking. How much effort is being spent on making sure that it doesn't take place? So everything is being exhausted towards resources. And Islamic methodology is don't look at the resources. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not want the highest building to be of a masjid or the place where he would preach. He did not want the largest Islamic army before he can defend Islam. But rather, he looked at who he had, and that would suffice. When Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was approached by one of the companions by the name of Ukasha in the Battle of Badr, he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam complaining. If I remember the number correctly, I think they had maybe 10, 20 swords. Ukasha radiallahu anhu, he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I don't have a sword to fight with. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he broke a branch of a tree and he gave it to him. He said, go fight with this, Ya Ukasha. Go fight with this. And Ukasha radiallahu anhu says, by the miracle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the faith that I had in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that became a sword. And a similar incident took place in the Battle of Uhud when Abdullah ibn Jahash radiallahu anh approached Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some narrations indicate that he did not have a sword, and some indicate that he was complaining that his sword had been broken due to the fight. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also gave him a branch, and that had become a sword. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's traveling, they run out of food. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, don't worry. These are materials. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide. Isa alayhi salam, the Ma'idah, it came from the heavens. It's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's beyond us. There is nothing we can limit ourselves to. And this is how, the more we visualize this and the more we think about it and put our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more avenues will open. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will feed you from a place min haythu la yahtasib, which you didn't even count one of those as your avenues. And this is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is merciful. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam also gave him a branch that go fight with this, Ya Abdullah, and he went and that became a sword as well. So this is, some of the stories that we see that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the way he trained the Sahaba, every single opportunity that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had, he exhausted it in making sure that it would affect your iman. Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in increased in number dramatically right before Hijrah. But even at that time, for almost 13 years they were being oppressed. For almost 13 years they were being abused. They were being harassed in every single fashion. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's instructions is you're not allowed to raise your voice, you're not allowed to raise your hand, you're not allowed to say anything. And that is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam training the Sahaba. And these were those warriors, these were those individuals who truly left a legacy. That is the reason why our hearts are believing Allah, Allah today. That these were the individuals that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam created. That is why, if we look at the methodology that is used amongst our great, pious predecessors, that they always concentrated on the people rather than concentrating on the resources. The next hadith, وبه قال حدثنا أبو جعفر محمد بن صدران البصري قال حدثنا طالب بن حجير عن هود وهو ابن عبد الله بن سعد عن جده قال دخل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مكة يوم الفتح وعلى سيفه ذهب وفضة. قال طالب فسألته عن الفضة فقال كانت قبيعة السيف فضة. The next narration is by the maternal grandfather of Hud radiallahu an. He narrates that when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam entered Makkah on the day of his conquest, he had a sword which was covered with gold and silver. Talib says, I asked Hud radiallahu an regarding the silver. He replied, the handle was made of silver. A few things to bear in mind, that in this narration it talks about that it had silver as well as gold. And we know gold is prohibited for men, and it is not allowed for men to use. So why did Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's sword have gold? Commentators mention various reasoning behind this. Number one is that this specific narration with this wording that it had gold and silver, it does not have a sound chain of narrators. That there is some weak link in the chain of narrators, and that is why it is not acceptable to know that there was gold in the sword as well. But even if we were to consider this as authentic, then it was at the time of the conquest of Makkah, as it is mentioned that دخل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مكة يوم الفتح, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam entered Makkah at the time of its conquest. And at that time, it's a possibility that the prohibition of gold came after. And that is why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not use the sword with gold in it after that. And some say that the gold here was referring to just the color gold. It was mixed, it was just the water of gold. The color was gold, it wasn't truly gold. And that is the reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used it. These were the few reasoning that the commentators give in regards to this sword. This sword is the same sword which is very famous that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam possessed, which was known as Dhul Fiqar. This was the name that is known as the sword's name was Dhul Fiqar. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam acquired this sword at the time of Badr, when the battle was over and everything was being distributed. At that time, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam kept this sword, and this is the same sword that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave to Ali radiallahu an. And this was the same sword about which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw a dream. Remember, even Fatah Makkah, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went for Umrah, he saw a dream about which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran. لَقَدْ صَدَقَ اللَّهُ رَسُولَهُ الرُّؤْيَا بِالْحَقِّ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made clear and made it truthful, the dream of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Similarly, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, before the battle of Uhud, he saw a dream. In his dream, he saw that there was cows being slaughtered. There were cows being slaughtered, and the blade of the sword of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had become dull. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw in his dream that he wore an armor, and because of that he was protected. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he interpreted this dream, he knew that certain individuals who are very, very close to him and dear to him are going to be sacrificed in this battle. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew that. So when he interpreted the dream, he knew that in the battle of Uhud, remember in the battle of Badr, a lot of the mushrikun were killed. So similarly, in the battle of Uhud, many of the Muslims were killed. Up to 70 Sahaba ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in were martyred, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam himself suffered certain injuries, which we know that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam tooth was also broken, and his jaw was injured to the extent that they had to use extensive treatment to stop the blood, because the blood wouldn't stop. So they had to melt different straw to stop the blood from the cheek of Rasulullah, the blessed cheek of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he saw this dream, many of the muhaddithun, they refer that same sword that he acquired in the battle of Badr was the same sword that was seen in the dream of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at that time. And when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam interpreted the dream, he said that the cows were referring to certain Sahaba radwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in who would be martyred, and the blade being dull means that it is obviously going to be a difficult victory, but when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam put on the armor and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved them. And that was when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam interpreted that portion, that after suffering different loss in the battlefield, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will overcome that and conquer the battlefield again. Once Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he came in the battle of Uhud. I believe it was the battle of Uhud. And he announced to the people that, who wants my sword? So obviously the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, they were such that if Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam would perform wudu, they would not even let that water go to waste, let alone the sword of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So while I was studying for this chapter, I trembled over this story that once Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam came and he announced, open market, who wants my sword? Obviously, all the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, now they're restless because they know there's only one sword. So now all the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in gathered and they said, Ya Rasulullah, we all want it. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, now the true message. Remember, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he had this very unique way of teaching the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. Once he was seated on the floor of a cemetery. He had a little twig in his hand. A little twig. But even at that time, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he drew a square, a rectangle. And then he drew a few lines within that rectangle. And he says, you know, this is a human being. He made one line, this is a human being. And you see these little lines that I made? These are all the things that he wants in his life. Those are all the obstacles that are coming in his way. Then he drew a long line that were exceeding past the box. And he said, you see this square box? It is the death that is surrounding a human being. That we don't even know that maybe we can just tremble over the staircase on the way outside of our home and we'll pass away. That this is how close death to us. But this is death surrounding the human being. And you see this long line that is going past and exceeding the lines of the box is the different desires of a human being. That if we're given multiple lives, yet our desires won't finish and our goals won't finish. And this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam teaching. So he had this very unique way of teaching that every time he would use an opportunity, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is passing by, he sees a dead goat, and he says, "Is anyone willing to buy this? Anyone willing to buy this?" Now, Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, the second sentence was more important. The second sentence is what he wanted everybody to hear. But the first question got their attention. So he said, is anybody willing to buy this? So the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala ajma'in said, Ya Rasulullah, this goat being in the pathway, being dead, being rotten, being covered with flies, itself shows its value. Who's going to purchase this? So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, immediately, now he has everyone's attention. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentions that, you see this goat, this dead goat, just the way you don't have any value for this goat, similarly, the entire world and all that it contains is less valuable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than this goat. This is Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam teaching. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the battle, he comes and he says, who wants my sword? Now all the Sahaba Ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in are gathered. Now Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam mentions, who is going to be the rightful owner and fulfill the rights of the sword? I will give it to that individual. Now the question started that, what are the rights of the sword? Obviously, if you're the sword bearer of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know what kind of responsibility it comes with. So now everything changed. So this is Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then he at that time he asked Abu Dujana radiyallahu an, and Abu Dujana radiyallahu an said, Ya Rasulullah, I will fulfill the right of the sword. And Abu Dujana radiyallahu an was given that sword by Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Inshallah, we'll have one more narration before we finish this chapter. وبه قال حدثنا محمد بن شجاع البغدادي قال حدثنا أبو عبيدة الحداد قال عن عثمان بن سعد عن ابن سيرين قال صنعت سيفي على سيف سمرة بن جندب وزعم سمرة أنه صنع سيفه على سيف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وكان حنفيا. Ibn Sirin, rahimahullah, narrates that I made my sword based on the sword of Samura ibn Jundub radiyallahu an. And he had his sword made based upon the sword of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the sword was from the tribe of Banu Hanifa. And Banu Hanifa was actually known for having very good quality swords. And this is the reason why Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam possessed one of their swords, and Samura ibn Jundub radiyallahu anh said, I had my sword made and fabricated just the way Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's sword was made. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to act upon everything that has been said, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to truly appreciate the freedoms and our values of our religion, and truly understand the depth of this religion. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
مولاي صل وسلم دائما